The sky above the Potomac was not merely dark, it was choked with the oily, rolling soot of national humiliation. On the night of August the 24th, 1814, the unthinkable had become reality. The United States Capitol was in flames, and the only light came from the burning skeleton of the president's own home. This is a tale of military precision that borders on the miraculous, a forgotten chapter of British daring where the accepted history is nothing but a shadow of the truth. If you seek to uncover such lost histories with us, do take a moment to subscribe to the channel, for the story of the 40-minute war is one that few dare to remember correctly. Stand amidst the smoke for a moment and observe the architects of this destruction. They are not a vast, conquering horde pouring over the horizon like the armies of antiquity. They are a mere sliver of a force, a dusty, red-coated column barely 2,000 strong. They are thousands of miles from the green fields of England, encrusted with the salt and sweat of a punishing American summer, and utterly outnumbered by the nation they have just brought to its knees. Yet here they sit, in the grand dining hall of the Executive Mansion, what we now call the White House, calmly feasting on the very supper Dolly Madison had ordered prepared for a victory celebration that never came. They drink the president's wine with the steady hands of men who have seen the worst of war in Europe and found the American defense wanting. It creates a tableau of profound irony. How did this happen? How did a force so small, operating without cavalry, dragging their cannons by hand through the suffocating heat, manage to dismantle the defenses of a rising nation on its own doorstep? The American narratives, written in the sting of defeat, often dismiss the event as a farce of incompetence. They speak of the Bladensburg races, a term coined to mock the speed with which the American militia fled the field. But to dismiss this victory as merely an American failure is a grave disservice to the brilliance of the men in red. It ignores the terrifying discipline of the British line. It ignores the audacity of the bayonet charge that shattered an army 3 times its size in less than an hour. It was not an accident. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare and tactical aggression, delivered by a generation of soldiers forged in the fires of the Peninsular War against Napoleon. They were the Invincibles, men who did not know how to retreat, and at their head rode a man of quiet demeanor, a soldier-scholar who despised the very destruction he was ordered to unleash. Major General Robert Ross was not a man of fire and brimstone, but a gentleman of the old school, beloved by his men and respected by his peers. He stands in the flickering light of the burning capital, the architect of Britain's most audacious raid. Little did he know, as he watched the flames lick the night sky, that this triumph was to be his final curtain call. The victory at Bladensburg and the capture of Washington would immortalize his name in the annals of military genius, but the cost would be absolute. The tragedy of war is that it often consumes its brightest suns just as they reach their zenith. But before the tragedy, there was the triumph. Before the silence of the grave, there was the roar of the rocket and the thunder of the drum. To understand how Washington fell, we cannot start in the ashes. We must rewind the clock. We must look across the Atlantic to a Europe drowning in blood, where the fate of the world hung in the balance, and this American conflict was viewed not as a war, but as an irritating distraction. The stage was set for a collision of impossible odds. The British Lion, weary from decades of fighting the French Eagle, had finally turned its gaze toward the insolent republic across the ocean, and the storm that was coming would be brief, violent, and utterly decisive. To understand why Washington burned, we must turn our gaze away from the Potomac and look back to the Old World, where the very map of civilization had been rewritten in blood. For nearly a quarter of a century, Britain had been locked in a titanic, existential struggle against the French Empire. The Corsican ogre, Napoleon Bonaparte, had cast a shadow so long and so dark that it seemed to swallow the sun itself. A generation of British men had known nothing but the drill, the march, and the roar of the cannon. They had fought on the seas, in the deserts of Egypt, and across the rugged spine of the Iberian Peninsula. By the spring of 1814, the British people were not merely tired. They were exhausted in a way that the modern mind can scarcely comprehend. The treasury was drained, the cemeteries were full, and the national spirit was frayed. But critically, they were victorious. Napoleon had abdicated. The great tyrant was caged on the island of Elba, and for the first time in decades the Royal Navy and the British Army could look up from the battlefields of Europe and notice the nagging thorn in their side across the Atlantic. The American War of 1812 was viewed in London not as a grand conflict, but as a treacherous distraction. To the British public, the United States had committed an unforgivable sin. They had declared war on Britain at the very moment she stood alone against Napoleonic tyranny. It was seen as a stab in the back, an act of opportunistic cowardice by a young republic that believed the British Empire was too distracted to fight back. And for 2 years the Americans had been largely correct. Secure in their hubris, the warhawks in Washington had assumed that the conquest of Canada would be, as Thomas Jefferson famously predicted, a mere matter of marching. They believed they were fighting a dying empire, a senile beast that could be carved up at leisure. They had burned the Parliament building in York, the capital of Upper Canada, confident that retribution was impossible. But in April 1814, the geopolitical equation shifted with violent abruptness. With France defeated, the seasoned legions of the British Army were suddenly unemployed. These were not the raw recruits or militia levies that the Americans had faced on the Canadian border. These were Wellington's Invincibles. We must pause to appreciate the caliber of these men. They were soldiers who had spent years fighting the finest armies in Europe. Their red coats were faded to a pale brick dust pink by the Spanish sun. Their boots were worn, their faces weathered by the harsh winds of the Pyrenees. They were men who had stood in the line of fire against the Imperial Guard and had not flinched. They possessed a professional lethality that the young American Republic simply could not conceptualize. They operated with a mechanical discipline, a silence in the ranks that was terrifying to behold. The British government, finally free to act, decided it was time to teach the upstart nation a lesson in manners. The orders issued from London were cold and precise. This was not to be a war of conquest. Britain had no desire to recolonize the United States. Rather, it was to be a punitive expedition. The objective was to chastise the Americans, to deliver a blow so severe, so humiliating, that it would shatter their morale and force them to abandon their designs on Canada. Thousands of these Peninsular veterans were loaded onto transports. They left behind the vineyards of France for the humid swamps of the Chesapeake. Among them were the men of the 4th, the 44th, and the 85th regiments. Regiments whose colours were already heavy with battle honours. They sailed with a grim sense of purpose. They were not going to America to liberate, they were going to punish. As the great fleet assembled in Bermuda and turned its prow toward the American coast, the mood in Washington remained dangerously complacent. The American government, blinded by its own rhetoric, could not believe that Britain would commit such resources to a raid. They ignored the warnings. They ignored the gathering storm clouds. Little did they know that the ships approaching their shores carried not just soldiers, but a specific brand of vengeance. And leading this force was a man who had spent his life mastering the art of the impossible. A man who looked at the maps of Maryland and saw not a defensive stronghold, but an open door. The trap was set, the ocean was crossed, and the Invincibles were coming. History often remembers the loud men, the braggarts, the tyrants, the flamboyant marshals who demand the spotlight. But the true architect of the devastation about to unfold in the Chesapeake was a man of a different cloth entirely. Major General Robert Ross was the quintessential Anglo-Irish gentleman. In a military culture that could often be brutal and aristocratic, Ross was a figure of quiet dignity and approachable warmth. He was a soldier's soldier, the kind of commander who would famously eat the last dry biscuit in his saddlebag, only after he was sure his men had been fed. Born in County Down, Ireland, Ross was not a man who thirsted for blood. By 1814, he was 47 years old, a seasoned professional who had seen the carnage of the French Revolutionary Wars and the desperate rearguard actions of Corunna. He had served under Sir John Moore and the Duke of Wellington, learning the grim trade of the Peninsular school. This was a school of warfare that valued steady lines, controlled fire, and the preservation of one's men over vainglorious charges. He had been wounded at the Battle of Austerlitz barely months prior, a bullet passing through his face. Yet here he was, half a world away from his recovering family, answering the call of duty with a stoic resolve. There is a tragic nobility to Ross. He did not hate the Americans. His letters reveal a man who viewed this expedition as a necessary professional task, not a crusade. He was, by all accounts, a reluctant conqueror, a man who preferred the precision of maneuver to the chaos of the torch. But if Ross was the cool, calculating head of the expedition, the man standing at his shoulder was its burning heart. Rear Admiral George Cockburn was everything Ross was not: brash, aggressive, and harboring a deep, personal disdain for the American democratic experiment. Cockburn had spent months terrorizing the Chesapeake coast, burning shipyards and liberating enslaved people to guide his ships, earning him a reputation as a pirate in the American press. He was the devil on the general's shoulder, constantly whispering in Ross's ear, urging him to be bolder, to strike deeper, to ignore the textbooks and aim for the throat of the enemy government. And what a weapon they had to wield! The force under Ross's command was small, painfully so, for an invasion of a hostile capital, but its quality was terrifying. These were the men of the 4th, the King's Own, the 44th, the East Essex, and the 85th, the Bucks Volunteers. To understand the fear they would inspire, one must understand what they had endured. These men were not the stiff, mechanical automatons of popular imagination. They were the survivors of the Peninsula. They had marched across the scorched plains of Spain and climbed the freezing passes of the Pyrenees. They were hard, lean, and utterly unimpressed by posturing. They wore their shakos battered and their redcoats faded to the colour of crushed brick. They had seen the best troops Napoleon could throw at them, the Imperial Guard, the Polish Lancers, and they had broken them all. They operated with a collective psychology that is difficult to replicate. They knew their business. They knew that if they stood shoulder to shoulder, levelled their muskets, and waited for the command, nothing on earth could break their line. They were a brotherhood of the damned and the saved, bound together by the lash of discipline, and the saved bound together by the regiment. When they looked at the American militia, they did not see soldiers, they saw civilians playing at war. Yet even for Wellington's Invincibles, the plan that Cockburn was proposing and that Ross was weighing seemed to teeter on the edge of madness. They were to land at Benedict, Maryland, and march nearly 50 miles inland. They would be moving away from the safety of the Royal Navy's guns, venturing deep into a country comprised of dense forests and rolling hills, terrain perfect for ambush. Most critically, and most dangerously, they had no cavalry. Not a single squadron of dragoons to scout ahead or protect their flanks. In the chess game of 19th century warfare, operating without cavalry was akin to fighting blindfolded. If the Americans possessed even a competent force of horsemen, the British column could be harassed, outmaneuvered, and cut to ribbons before they even saw the city. Furthermore, they had almost no transport. The artillery, the heavy 6-pounder guns, and the Congreve rocket frames would have to be dragged by hand or by sailors pulling on ropes like mules. It was, on paper, a suicide mission, a small, slow-moving column, blinded and burdened, walking into the heart of an enemy nation that could theoretically mobilize tens of thousands of defenders. Ross hesitated. His instincts as a prudent commander warned him against the risk. He knew that one wrong turn, one broken bridge, or one spirited American defense could lead to the capture of his entire force, a humiliation that would undo all the victories of the Peninsula. But Cockburn was relentless. He promised Ross that the Americans were demoralized, that their government was in disarray, and that a swift, sharp blow would collapse their resistance like a house of cards. The tension in the command tent must have been palpable. The weight of the decision rested solely on Ross. To retreat was safe, but to advance was to court immortality or ruin. In the end, the soldier in him won out. He trusted his men. He trusted that 2,000 British veterans were worth 10,000 of any other army on earth. The order was given. The boats were lowered. The boots of the Invincibles crunched onto the sandy soil of Maryland. As they formed their columns and looked toward the dense, humid tree line that swallowed the road to Washington, the men adjusted their packs and checked their flints. They were marching into the unknown, stripped of every advantage save for their own iron will. Little did they know that the heat they were about to encounter would be a fiercer enemy than the American army, or that the road to Bladensburg would become a furnace that would test the limits of human endurance before a single shot was fired. The landing at Benedict, Maryland, was deceptive in its tranquility. The Patuxent River flowed gently, the water lapping against the hulls of the troopships as the Invincibles disembarked. But as the boots of the 4th, 44th and 85th Regiments sank into the soft, sandy soil, the true enemy revealed itself. It was not the American militia, at least not yet. It was the Chesapeake Sun. It is difficult to convey to a modern mind accustomed to climate control the sheer physical brutality of marching in wool in an American August. The temperature soared well above 35 degrees Celsius, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, saturated with a humidity so thick it felt as though one were breathing soup. And these men were not dressed for the tropics. They were clad in the heavy red wool coats designed for the cool damp of Europe, strapped with 60 pounds of kit, musket, bayonet, ammunition, water canteen, and knapsack. As the column began to move, the march transformed into a furnace. The road to Washington became a trail of suffering. Men, hardened veterans who had survived the retreat to Corunna, began to stumble and fall, their faces flushed a deep, alarming, violent red before they collapsed into the dust, victims of sunstroke. There were no ambulances to carry them, no cavalry to sweep them up. Those who fell were left behind, gasping for air in the roadside ditches. The logistics of the advance were, quite frankly, a nightmare. Without horses to pull the artillery or the ammunition wagons, the burden fell to the men and to the sailors. Admiral Cockburn had landed a detachment of Royal Marines and Royal Navy seamen, the Jacks, to assist the army. These sailors, displaying that peculiar, boisterous humour of the senior service, strapped themselves into the harnesses of the cannon. With pipes smoking and cutlasses rattling, they dragged the 6-pounder guns and the rocket frames through the dust, cheering as if they were hauling in a prize ship, dubbing themselves amphibious horses. It was a display of grit that was equal parts inspiring and insane. For days they marched in an eerie silence. The woods of Maryland were dense and foreboding, shutting out the breeze but trapping the heat. Every rustle of leaves could have been an ambush. Every bend in the road could have concealed a rifleman. Yet the American army remained elusive, a phantom force that retreated constantly before them. But in Washington, there was no silence. There was only panic. The American capital was a scene of chaos. President James Madison and his cabinet were attempting to manage a war that had suddenly arrived on their doorstep. The defense of the region had been entrusted to Brigadier General William Winder, a political appointee whose military resume was, to put it politely, thin. Winder was a man out of his depth, frantically issuing orders and counter-orders, riding his horse to exhaustion as he tried to assemble a defense from a patchwork of local militia and a handful of regulars. Yet, despite the chaos, Winder had one distinct advantage. The geography was on his side. He knew where Ross had to go. To reach Washington, the British had to cross the eastern branch of the Potomac River, and the only viable crossing point for an army with artillery was the bridge at the sleepy village of Bladensburg. By the morning of August 24th, Winder had funneled his forces there. The trap was set. As the British column emerged from the stifling woods and the village of Bladensburg came into view, the scale of the challenge became terrifyingly clear. Across the river, on the rising ground of the opposite bank, the American army was waiting. And it was not the phantom force anymore, it was a grand army in full view. They were arrayed in 3 defensive lines, tier upon tier of infantry and artillery looking down upon the river. There were nearly 7,000 of them, more than 3 times the number of Ross's exhausted brigade. They had dug earthworks, they had positioned heavy artillery to sweep the bridge, They held the high ground, creating a veritable amphitheater of death where every British soldier who stepped onto that bridge would be visible to thousands of American muskets. Major General Ross halted his column. He rode forward to survey the scene with his spyglass, the heat shimmering off the river. What he saw would have made a lesser commander turn back immediately. He saw the bridge a narrow wooden choke point that the Americans had failed inexplicably to destroy, but which was now the focal point of 18 American cannons. He saw the masses of troops on the ridge, their flags fluttering, their confidence buoyed by their superior numbers and their impregnable position. He saw his own men, dusty, dehydrated, their tongues swollen with thirst, their numbers dwindled by the heat. They had marched for hours without a proper meal. They were effectively trapped. To retreat now would be to invite the Americans to attack his rear, likely destroying his force in the woods. To stay put was to be encircled. The only way out was through. Ross lowered his glass. He exchanged a look with Admiral Cockburn. There was no time for subtle maneuvering. There was no time to wait for the cover of darkness. The Invincibles would have to do the impossible. They would have to walk directly into the teeth of the American guns, cross the bridge under fire, and storm the heights. It was a decision that defied all military logic. It relied entirely on the moral superiority of the British regular over the American citizen soldier. It was a gamble of the highest order, staking the entire expedition, and perhaps the security of Canada, on a single, brazen assault. Ross turned to the commander of the Light Brigade. His voice was calm, betraying none of the tension that must have been tightening his chest. He did not ask for a complex formation. He simply pointed to the bridge, the wooden planks baking in the sun, silent and waiting. "You will take the bridge," he ordered. The drums began to beat. The dusty red ranks stiffened. The men checked their bayonets one last time, squinting against the glare. Across the water, the American gunners lit their matches, watching the small cluster of redcoats form up. They must have thought the British were mad. Little did they know that the madness was about to come to them. The silence that hangs over a battlefield in the moments before the first volley is a heavy, suffocating thing. At Bladensburg, that silence was magnified by the oppressive heat, the air shimmering above the wooden planks of the bridge like a mirage. To the soldiers of the British Light Brigade, standing in their loose skirmish order on the western bank, the bridge did not look like a crossing point. It looked like a funnel. It was a narrow wooden structure, barely wide enough for a farm cart, spanning the sluggish, muddy waters of the eastern branch. But looking down the throat of that bridge were the black muzzles of the American artillery. Brigadier General Winder had placed his guns with deadly intent, creating a kill zone where every inch of the timber was covered by canister and grape shot. Behind the guns stood thousands of American infantry, secure in their earthworks, watching the small cluster of redcoats with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The mathematics of the situation was stark. A frontal assault across a narrow bridge against fortified artillery is a maneuver that military academies teach students to avoid at all costs. It is a recipe for massacre. But Major General Ross, watching from the saddle, knew that time was his enemy. Every minute he delayed allowed the Americans to reinforce their lines and his own men to succumb further to dehydration. He nodded to Colonel William Thornton of the 85th Regiment. The order was given not with a shout, but with the quiet, steel-edged calm of the professional. Advance. What followed was a scene of such raw, kinetic violence that it seems to unfold in the mind's eye in slow motion. The light company of the 85th, the Bucks volunteers, stepped onto the bridge. They did not run initially. They moved with a steady, loping pace, their rifles held across their chests. For a heartbeat, there was no sound but the thud of boots on timber. Then the American line erupted. The sound was not a crack, but a roar, a tearing, thunderous crash as the American cannons unleashed their iron hail. Grape shot is a horrific weapon. It turns a cannon into a giant shotgun, spraying hundreds of iron balls in a widening cone of death. The air above the bridge instantly turned into a buzzing hive of metal. The rail fences splintered into toothpicks. The water of the Potomac whipped into a froth. and the front rank of the British column simply evaporated. Men were thrown backward as if struck by invisible sledgehammers. The disciplined formation was instantly torn into a bloody ruin of red wool and white crossbelts. The screams of the wounded were swallowed by the ringing in the ears of the survivors. In an instant, the bridge was slick with blood, the wooden planks becoming a treacherous, slippery slope of gore. To the Americans watching from the heights, it must have seemed as though the attack had been smashed before it had even begun. They cheered, a ragged, triumphant shout that rolled down the hill, convinced that no human force could walk through such a fire. But they did not know the 85th. This is the moment where the training of the Peninsular War, the discipline of the lash and the line, revealed its terrifying utility. In a militia unit, seeing your comrades torn apart by cannon fire causes panic. The instinct is to freeze, to turn, to run. But the British soldier of 1814 had the instinct drilled out of him. His reality was the voice of his sergeant and the back of the man in front of him. Instead of retreating, the survivors of the first volley did the unthinkable. They lowered their heads and ran into the smoke. Colonel Thornton, waving his sword, urged them forward. "Push on! Push on! Push on!" came the cry. The men scrambled over the bodies of their friends, slipping on the blood-slicked timber, their faces blackened by powder and twisted in exertion. A second volley tore through them, then a third. The casualties were appalling. The bridge was becoming a charnel house. But the momentum had shifted. The sheer suicidal audacity of the charge seemed to paralyze the American gunners. They were reloading as fast as they could, fumbling with rammers and sponges, their eyes widening as they saw the red shapes emerging from the smoke, closer now, impossibly closer. The British were not stopping. They were sprinting through the kill zone, fueled by a cold, furious adrenaline. And then the first British boot hit the mud on the eastern bank. This was the turning point not just of the battle, but of the psychological war. The moment the Light Brigade cleared the bridge, the dynamic changed. They fanned out, taking cover behind the willow trees and a small brick house near the water's edge. But here is the detail that truly broke the American spirit. It was not the charge itself, but what happened immediately after. Having crossed the bridge of death, having survived the artillery storm, the British troops did not dissolve into a disorganized mob of berserkers. They did not rush blindly up the hill in a rage. They stopped. They listened to their officers. And they reformed the line. Imagine the view from the American entrenchments. You have just poured tons of iron onto a narrow bridge. You have seen men die in droves. And yet, the survivors are now standing at the foot of your hill, calmly dressing their ranks, checking their flints, and waiting for the order to advance again, as if they were on a parade ground in London. It was a display of professional cool that was alien to the raw American recruits. It communicated a singular, terrifying message. We are not like you. We do not fear you. And we are coming. The American riflemen in the first line, commanded by William Pinckney, began to fire. But their shots were ragged, born of nerves. The British light infantry, now deployed in skirmish order, began to return fire with deadly accuracy. These were the men who had learned their trade skirmishing against the French voltigeurs. They worked in pairs, using the terrain, picking off the American officers and the artillery crews with ruthless efficiency. The pressure began to build. The American artillery, which had been so lethal against the bridge, was now struggling to depress their guns low enough to hit the British troops gathering at the river's edge. The British were now moving underneath the arc of the cannon fire, inching their way up the slope. Colonel Thornton, though wounded, kept the pressure on. More troops were pouring across the bridge now. The men of the 44th Regiment, stepping over the carnage of the 85th to join the fray. The bottleneck had been broken. The British army was across the river. Up on the heights, the confidence of the American militia began to fracture. The Invincibles were no longer a distant rumour. They were at the bottom of the hill, fixing their bayonets. The shiny steel glinted in the cruel August sun. The militia looked at their neighbours, seeing the fear reflected in their eyes. They looked at the British, who moved with the inexorable, mechanical certainty of a tide coming in. The Battle of Bladensburg had begun with a massacre on the bridge, but the British had paid the butcher's bill without flinching. Now the transaction was complete. They had bought their foothold with blood, and as the smoke cleared over the river, revealing the thin red line snaking its way up the slope, the Americans realized with a dawning horror that the artillery had not stopped them. And if cannon fire couldn't stop them, what could? The answer, as Ross was about to demonstrate, was nothing. But the British had one more card to play, a weapon of terror that would turn the American anxiety into outright panic. As the infantry began their ascent, a strange screeching sound began to emanate from the British rear, a noise like a banshee wailing across the battlefield. The Congreve rockets were being brought forward. Little did the Americans know the true psychological assault was only just beginning. The British foothold on the eastern bank of the Potomac had been purchased with the blood of the Light Brigade, but the battle was far from won. In fact, to the cold, tactical eye of a man like General Ross, the situation remained perilous in the extreme. His small force was now severed from its retreat by the very bridge they had just crossed. They were clustered in the marshy lowlands, their uniforms heavy with sweat and river water, gasping for breath in the stifling oven of the afternoon heat. Above them, waiting on the rising ground, stood the bulk of the American army, thousands of fresh men, shaken perhaps by the bridge assault, but still numerically vastly superior and securely dug in behind rail fences and earthworks. A frontal assault up that slope, against massed musketry and artillery, would be a meat grinder. The British infantry, for all their discipline, were exhausted. To send them straight up into the teeth of the American guns would be to court disaster. Ross needed something else. He needed a way to break the enemy's nerve before his men had to use their bayonets. He needed to turn the American anxiety into terror. And so he signaled for the infernal machines. From the rear of the British column, a detachment of the Royal Marine Artillery moved forward. They did not drag heavy cannons. Instead, they carried strange, cumbersome wooden frames and long iron-cased tubes attached to heavy guiding sticks. These were the Congreve rockets, a weapon that was the subject of much debate and derision within the British military establishment. The Duke of Wellington himself despised them, famously remarking that he did not want to set fire to the town, he wanted to capture it. They were notoriously inaccurate, erratic, and liable to explode on the launch frame as often as they hit the enemy. But at Bladensburg, accuracy was irrelevant. Ross did not need to hit a specific man, he needed to shatter a collective mind. As the rocket frames were planted in the mud, the American militia on the hill watched with confusion. They had never seen such apparatus. They were accustomed to the boom of cannon and the crack of the musket sounds of war that were terrible, certainly, but familiar. They understood the physics of a cannonball. They were not prepared for the sound that came next. When the fuses were lit, the rockets did not fire with a bang. They erupted with a prolonged, ear-splitting shriek, a sound often compared by veterans to a soul in torment, or a scalded cat magnified 1,000 times. The iron tubes tore into the air, leaving behind thick, serpentine trails of grey smoke and sparks. The visual effect was a dazzling absurdity. The rockets did not fly in a clean arc. They corkscrewed, they dipped, they swerved. Some buried themselves in the mud. Others exploded mid-air in a flash of crimson light, the very rocket's red glare that would, weeks later, be immortalized in the American national anthem. But to the raw, untrained militia on the heights, this was not a firework display. It was the apocalypse. Imagine the psychological impact on a young shopkeeper or farmer who has been standing in the sun for hours, terrified, watching the professional killers of the British Army assemble below. Suddenly the sky is filled with screeching demons. A rocket slams into the earthwork next to him, spewing fire. Another screams over his head, sounding as if it is hunting him personally. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The American horses, unaccustomed to the noise, went mad. The mules pulling the ammunition wagons bolted, tearing through the rear lines and causing confusion. The cavalry horses reared and threw their riders. Even the steady mounts of the officers began to dance and shy, breaking the chain of command. and in the center of this chaos stood the President of the United States, James Madison, a man of intellect and laws, not of blood and iron, had ridden out to witness the battle, accompanied by his cabinet. He was now in the thick of a bombardment that defied all conventions of civilized warfare. One can only imagine the humiliation and the horror as the leader of the free world found himself nearly unhorsed by a British terror weapon, his entourage scattering as the rockets hissed around them like angry vipers. The president was essentially forced to flee the field to avoid capture, a moment of symbolic decapitation for the American defense. Seeing their president retreat and their officers struggling to control their panicked mounts, the resolve of the militia began to evaporate. The ghost in the machine, that fragile belief that they could stand and fight, was exorcised by the noise. General Ross, watching the confusion ripple through the American lines like a wind through wheat, knew the moment had arrived. The psychological armor of the enemy was cracked. Now he would shatter it. He ordered the infantry to advance. The contrast between the two forces could not have been more stark. Above, there was noise, smoke, shouting, and the screech of rockets. Below, there was a terrifying silence. The British troops, the men of the 4th and 44th, fixed their bayonets and began the climb. They did not shout. They did not fire. They simply walked uphill, a long, disjointed red line, moving with the inevitability of a glacier. To the wavering militia, this silent advance was more frightening than the rockets. The rockets were chaos. The Redcoats were order. The British were flanking them now, moving through the woods on the American left, threatening to encircle the position. The American 5th Regiment, the dandy 5th from Baltimore, tried to hold the line. They were the best of the American troops, wearing confident uniforms and carrying the pride of their city. They fired volleys into the British ranks, dropping men, creating gaps in the red line, but the gaps simply closed. The British stepped over their dead and kept coming. They were closing the distance 100 yards, 50 yards, 30 yards. The Invincibles were now close enough that the Americans could see the faces of the men who had burned the French Empire to the ground. They could see the grime, the sweat, and the cold, flat look of intent. This is the moment where a battle is decided not by the number of men, but by the fragility of hope. The American militia looked at the rockets tearing the sky. They looked at the silent bayonet-tipped wall approaching them, and they made the calculation that every conscript makes when pushed beyond their limit. I am going to die here for nothing. It started with a few men dropping their muskets and slipping away to the rear. Then a squad. Then a whole company. The line did not break cleanly. It dissolved. The panic that had started with the horses now infected the men. The dandy 5th found themselves unsupported, their flanks evaporating. Suddenly, the orderliness of the American formation collapsed into a stampede. The retreat was sounded, but it was unnecessary. The army was already leaving. The rockets had done their work. They had stripped away the illusion of safety, and the bayonet had done the rest. As the British troops crested the hill, breathing hard, sweat stinging their eyes, they did not find a line of battle waiting for them. They found abandoned knapsacks, discarded muskets, and the backs of thousands of men running for their lives. The heights of Bladensburg, which should have been a fortress, had been taken in less than an hour. The battle proper was over. The hunt was about to begin. The road to Washington lay open, a dusty ribbon leading straight to the heart of the young republic. But the speed of the American collapse was so absolute, so comical in its swiftness, that the British soldiers, exhausted as they were, could not help but laugh. They were too tired to run, too thirsty to chase. They could only watch as the Grand Army of the United States vanished into the woods. Little did they know that this retreat would go down in history, not as a tragic withdrawal, but with a name that would sting American pride for a century. The Bladensburg races had begun, and the prize at the finish line was the capital of the United States. The collapse of the American army at Bladensburg was not merely a retreat, it was a phenomenon. In the annals of military history, withdrawals are often somber, bloody affairs, conducted with grim rearguard actions to save the army from annihilation. But what occurred on the heights above the eastern branch was something altogether different. It was a dissolution so total, so rapid, and so panicked that it earned a moniker that dripped with sardonic humour: the Bladensburg races. To the exhausted British soldiers standing on the ridge, gasping for air in the oppressive heat, the sight was surreal. They watched as thousands of men, an entire army, simply threw away their weapons and ran. The retreat did not follow the roads. It spilled over fences, trampled through cornfields, and vanished into the woods. It was a stampede of fear. The American militia, terrified by the rockets and the bayonets, moved with a speed that the British, laden with 60 pounds of kit and parched with thirst, could not hope to match. There is a dark comedy to the scene. The British officers, wiping the soot from their faces, realized that pursuit was physically impossible. Their men were spent. They had marched through the furnace of the day, stormed a bridge under cannon fire, and climbed a hill in the face of musketry. They had nothing left in their legs, and so the victors did not chase the vanquished. They simply collapsed onto the grass, watching the dust clouds recede toward Washington, and laughed. It was the laughter of relief, of disbelief, and of the adrenaline crash that follows survival. However, amidst this ignominious rout, there was one pocket of resistance that salvaged the honor of the American nation. One group of men did not run, and it is here, in the final bloody act of the battle, that we find the emotional anchor of the day. While the militia fled, a sturdy grey-haired man named Commodore Joshua Barney stood his ground. He commanded a detachment of some 400 sailors and marinesmen of the sea, stranded on land. They had dragged their heavy naval guns from their scuttled flotilla and planted them astride the main road. Unlike the conscripts, these were hard-bitten jack-tars, men who were accustomed to the brutal close-quarters carnage of naval boarding actions. They did not fear the bayonet, they feared only the shame of striking their colours. As the British light infantry, flushed with victory, surged forward to sweep the road clear, they ran into a wall of iron. Barney's men unleashed a devastating fire. Their heavy cannons, served with the precision of a man of war, tore through the British ranks. For the first time all day, the British advance was checked. The 85th Regiment, the heroes of the bridge, were thrown back. They regrouped and charged again, only to be met with a countercharge that was ferocious in its intensity. The combat that ensued was primal. It was not the orderly volley fire of the early battle. It was a melee of cutlass against bayonet, pistol against musket butt. The American sailors, shouting their defiance, fought with a savage gallantry that stunned the British regulars. They held their position against the entire weight of Ross's army for nearly half an hour, an eternity in close combat. General Ross himself rode forward to direct the assault, exposing himself to the fire with his customary disregard for safety. It was here that he nearly met his end. A ball struck his horse, dropping the beast beneath him. Ross tumbled to the dust, unhurt but shaken, a stark reminder of how thin the line is between a conqueror and a casualty. But courage alone cannot defeat mathematics. The British flankers, moving with that inexorable professional discipline, began to encircle Barney's position. They climbed the ridges on either side of the road, pouring fire down into the sailors' flanks. The Invincibles were now closing the net. One by one, the American gunners were picked off. Commodore Barney, bleeding from a severe wound in the thigh, finally realized the futility of further slaughter. His militia support had long since vanished over the horizon. He was alone. He ordered his guns spiked and his men to retreat. He himself, unable to walk, collapsed by his cannon, awaiting his fate. What followed was a moment of chivalry that seems to belong to a lost age. When the British troops overran the position, they did not bayonet the fallen enemy commander. Instead, General Ross and Admiral Cockburn approached the wounded Commodore. They knew a brave man when they saw one. Ross, dusting himself off from his fall, bowed to Barney. He praised the gallantry of the American sailors, remarking that they were the only men who had given him a real fight that day. He immediately paroled Barney and ordered his own surgeons to tend to the American's wound. It was a gesture of profound respect, a a recognition between warriors that transcended the politics of the war. But as Barney was carried off the field, the reality of the situation settled over the battlefield. The guns fell silent. The smoke began to drift away on the evening breeze. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the trampled cornfields and the corpse-strewn bridge. The Bladensburg races were over. The American army had ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. The road to Washington lay wide open, a dusty, undefended path leading straight to the heart of the enemy capital. The British troops, exhausted but triumphant, began to reform their columns. They drank greedily from the river, washed the black powder from their faces, and looked toward the south. In the distance, through the haze of the humid evening, they could just make out the faint, twinkling lights of a city. It was Washington. A strange hush fell over the ranks. They had done the impossible. They had marched into the enemy's country, outnumbered and unassisted, and they had routed his army in open battle. Now the prize lay before them, helpless and waiting. But as the order was given to fall in, and the drums began the slow, rhythmic beat of the march once more, a heavy sense of anticipation hung in the air. They were not marching to a battle anymore. They were marching to a funeral pyre. The destruction they were about to unleash would ring through history, a scar on the American psyche that would never fully heal. As the sun set, painting the sky in colors of bruised purple and blood red, the Invincibles stepped off toward the city, their shadows stretching out before them like the fingers of a grasping hand. Little did they know that while they had won the battle, the night that followed would ignite a fire of vengeance that would ultimately consume their beloved general and change the course of the war forever. The races were done. The burning was about to begin. Darkness had claimed the city of Washington by the time the vanguard of the British Army marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. It was a surreal procession. The streets were deserted, the windows dark, the silence broken only by the rhythmic tramp of boots and the occasional bark of a stray dog. The government had fled. The defenders had vanished. The capital of the United States was a ghost town, waiting for its conquerors. General Robert Ross rode into the city not with the swagger of a looting barbarian, but with the grim composure of a judge delivering a sentence. He halted his men in the square facing the Capitol building. There was no resistance, save for a single foolish shot fired from a window that killed the horse of the general himself. It was a final, futile gesture of defiance that sealed the city's fate. What followed was not an act of wanton vandalism, as American history books have so often claimed. It was a calculated act of 19th-century retribution. It was the strict application of lex talionis, the law of retaliation. The Americans had burned the Parliament buildings in York, Canada, a year prior. Now the debt was to be paid in kind. The order was given. The troops piled furniture, books, and drapes into the center of the magnificent Capitol building. They applied the torch. The flames caught quickly, fed by the dry timber and the night air. Within moments, the seat of American democracy was a roaring furnace, the windows glowing orange against the black sky. From there, the column moved to the president's house. They found the dining table set, the wine uncorked, the food still warm, a ghostly reminder of the dinner party that had been interrupted by history. The officers drank a toast to the king, ate the president's supper, and then, with a professional detachment, set the mansion ablaze. As the night deepened, the sky over Washington turned a bruised, violent purple, illuminated by the twin pyres of the Capitol and the White House. It was a scene of apocalyptic grandeur. From miles away, the fleeing American officials could look back and see the destruction of their hopes. The Invincibles had done exactly what they threatened to do. They had chastised the child nation, but nature, it seemed, had one final card to play. The following day, as the British continued their work of destruction, the sky turned a terrifying shade of green. A hurricane, arguably a tornado, tore through the city with biblical fury. It ripped roofs from houses, knocked cannons off their carriages, and doused the flames with a torrential deluge. It was as if Providence itself had decided that enough was enough. The storm effectively saved the rest of Washington from the torch, and in the chaos of the tempest, Ross decided that the point had been made, the mission was accomplished. the army formed up and marched out, leaving behind a smoking ruin and a humbled nation. They returned to their ships, undefeated, unbowed, and ready for the next campaign. But the gods of war are jealous deities, and they rarely grant such triumphs without demanding a terrible price. The fleet turned north, toward the privateer's nest of Baltimore. The mood was high. The men believed they were invincible. But on September 12th, barely 3 weeks after the triumph at Bladensburg, the tragedy struck. As the British column advanced through the woods towards Baltimore, General Ross, riding at the front as was his habit, was struck by a sniper's bullet. It passed through his arm and into his chest. He fell into the arms of his aide-de-camp. There were no last words of grand strategy, no exhortations of glory. He simply thought of his wife, murmuring, "My dear wife," before slipping into unconsciousness. He died as he was being carried back to the boats. The shock to the army was absolute. The Invincibles had lost their heart. Without Ross's cool genius, the attack on Baltimore faltered. The British were repulsed, and the Star-Spangled Banner remained waving over Fort McHenry. The death of Major General Robert Ross is the great what-if of the War of 1812. He was a commander of rare brilliance, a man who balanced aggression with humanity, discipline with daring. Had he lived, the history of North America might have been drawn differently. Instead, he became a martyr, his body preserved in a barrel of rum, and sailed north to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he lies today in the old burying ground. His legacy, however, is etched not just on his tombstone, but in the very way nations fight. Bladensburg was a harsh lesson for the young United States. It proved once and for all that a militia of free citizens, no matter how patriotic, could not stand against a professional army. It forced the reforms that would eventually build the American military into a global power. But for us, looking back through the mist of 2 centuries, the story is about the men in the faded redcoats. It is about the 40-minute war where 2,000 exhausted soldiers routed an army 3 times their size. It is a testament to the power of discipline, the value of leadership, and the enduring tragedy that the brightest flames often burn the shortest. Washington was rebuilt. The scars of the fire were painted over white, giving the president's house its famous name. But the memory of that August night and the forgotten genius who orchestrated it remains a ghost in the machinery of history, a reminder that impossible odds are only impossible until the right man decides to overcome them.